All right. Then in that case, let me get the embed. We are live, but theoretically, not everyone might be watching because it hasn't been embedded onto the event page. So if you are watching and you don't belong to the podcasters community on Google+, you should go over there and belong to that, because that's where I post, not even to my own circle, you can circle me if you like, but that's where I post announcements about Podcasters Roundtable when we have them, because it's a great community, and I'd rather share there, where a lot more people are talking about podcasting. So go over there, and I think we've got the player now embedded, and we should be rolling. Daniel can tell the chat room to refresh, and it looks like the page is there. So this is for all those podcast listeners listening afterwards or watching the archive, this is the fun of live, right? Producing live always introduces nice hiccups. And so what are we doing tonight? Well, I can tell you that I guess I threw a match and lit a forest fire at this point. It's not just a little fire. The comments leading up to this topic, they were interesting to say the least. Okay, so I rattled a few cages and out fell a whole bunch of opinions, which is great because that's really what we're looking for here on Podcasters Roundtable. So that alone, the reaction to the topic, what do you call your podcast? Kind of a weird name, and we'll get into that. It was kind of hard to name this one. The reaction to that was visceral. So we are really talking about, well, I'll read the description. So the description of the actual episode on the event page was, the term podcast has a specific meaning. And so if you have a show, audio or video, that you post to an RSS feed, I say congrats, you have a podcast. To me, you do. Whether you like it or not, you can kind of hear my bias built into the title of the episode. What do you call your podcast? Because I think you have a podcast. So you know where I may fall on this. But what do you call it, right? If not a podcast, then what? A show, internet broadcast, netcast, something else. And more importantly, why do you call it that? Okay. And so does the term podcast, does it affect the medium, that what we're doing here? Does it affect its growth, good or bad, is something we're going to talk about. And does it even matter what we call it? Okay. And those are some of the things we're going to get into. There was a little confusion, or the conversation splintered off into a conversation about changing the name podcast. So I want to talk quickly what we're not talking about tonight. This is not a conversation, should we change the name, all right? That ship has sailed, at least as far as this show is concerned. The cat's out of the bag, people. It's podcasting, right? So this is also not about changing anyone's mind or convincing them that someone's definition of their own content is wrong. If you don't call it a podcast, awesome. That's what we're going to talk about. I want to know more about that, okay? So what we are talking about, again, this is a conversation about you and your content. How do you define it and define yourself, okay? There's podcast, podcasting, podcasters. All my shows have the word podcast in it. So again, bias in your face, okay? And what do you say to people when you describe your podcast? And, I call it podcast, but I do use the word show interchangeably, and we can get into that. So after absorbing all that happened in the chat and thinking about all the feedbacks from those comments, I wanted to challenge the roundtable and those of you in chat. Thanks for joining us. Think about how a conversation about the word podcast can push us and the medium forward. So I'm going to come back to you on that one. So you do need to think about it, and which can be tough when we're in the middle of a conversation. But hopefully someone's got some answers for that, and I think that it's going to naturally evolve that way. Okay, let's get some introductions. A little slow here. We have a large roundtable again, which is cool. I love it because we can bring on more new roundtablers, as I like to call them, although spell check will tell you that's not correct. It's our own special term here. So let's start with the new tonight. And right next to me, wrong way, boom, give him a shoulder bump, a hip check to Dustin Hartzler. Dustin, welcome to your first Podcasters Roundtable. Tell us a little bit about your main podcast. If you only have one, or if you have a whole bunch, tell us about the main one.
Sure. Well, thanks, Ray, for having me on. It seems like I never were able to, the timing never worked out. I was always out of town, or I was driving right when this was happening. So I'm excited to be here. Your Website Engineer podcast is the show that I produce on a weekly basis. It's all about WordPress and just teaches people how to use WordPress better, and just tips and tricks and tools and all that kind of stuff just to have a better site. I know a lot of people that are in the podcasting community use WordPress as their platform, so I like to help out WordPress or help out podcasters as much as I can.
Cool. Maybe we can have a roundtable where we argue about CMSs, right? CMSs.
Yes.
CMS. All right. Looking forward to it. Thanks. The other side to me, other check. I look like I'm dancing. I look like I'm in a boy band. Okay. Richard Cleveland, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ray. It's been a long time because you and I have talked on other hangouts and that sort of thing. But thanks for having me on the show. The network that I've been putting together over the past year is called Naked Ape Productions, and we do a show every Saturday called Between the Pages. It's a comic book and geek culture show. We do reviews, news, interviews, all kinds of stuff every Saturday afternoon. And I've been working on 2 other shows as Daniel had asked me earlier, when is that show going to get on iTunes? It's called Podcast You. It's about the art of podcasting. We're still kind of in the alpha stage of that show. And we also do a show called Popcorn Lobby, which is a movie discussion program.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. And let's get to the regulars, co-hosts here at Podcasters Roundtable, Daniel and Dave. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, or as Dave Jackson wants to now call me, DJL. And I'm from theaudacitytopodcast.com, the award-winning how-to podcast about podcasting and using Audacity.
Hey, Daniel, we'll do a little behind-the-scenes live. You can probably turn up your audio just a little bit. Thank you. Dave, welcome to the show.
Yeah, I'm Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting. You can find me at schoolofpodcasting.com, where I have self-paced tutorials and resources for anyone looking to start a podcast. And I'm very glad to be here with my with my facial tissues. We'll talk about that later.
Oh, okay. I'm a little under the weather too, so if you see me just bolt out of my seat here, then that's why we have co-host.
Right.
And that man you just saw flash on the screen, or if you're listening on the podcast, I think I heard a lip smack. Rob Greenlee, welcome.
Well, it's great to be here again. I think I was on, a few months ago. It's great to be back on the show. For those that don't know who I am, I run the Zune podcast catalog on Windows Phone, and I've been doing that for, 5 or 6 years now. And actually I'm a co-host on a podcast again. The New Media Show with Todd Cochran airs on Saturday mornings at 9 a.m. Pacific time, and we talk about all sorts of new media topics, as well as podcasting on occasion. So it's great to be back.
Yep, it's good to have you back, and we like having the authority and the people behind the scenes of podcasting. That's really cool, and I'm a huge fan of the now New Media Show, right? It used to be called Saturday Morning Tech Show, and then just Tech Show. Anyways, I'm a fan. You guys, if you're into podcasting, you should check it out, because Rob, I think he schedules the guest, brings on some heavy hitters in the space, and they talk about network building and monetizing this whole thing and the future of podcasts, and I love it. And I think that's why they went from a tech show to a podcast. Well, it's not a podcast; it's New Media Show. Ooh, there we go. Right? It's not a podcasting. Yep. All right. So thanks, Rob. And last but not least, our buddy down there on the end, Steve.
Why am I always last, Ray?
Save the best for last, buddy.
Want front and center next time, okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Change your name to Adam.
Oh, what was that, Daniel?
Change your name to Adam, and you'll be front and center then.
I've been called a lot of other things that start with an A, but leave that one there. Yeah, I'm Steve Lee, everyone. Thanks for letting me join you this evening. I run netcaststudio.com, a whole mirage of different kinds of...
What was it called?
netcaststudio.com, and we'll get into that. Where I host a mirage of podcasts.
Oh, now I'm confused. All right.
And I'm also the creator of twothumbsupmedia.com, so if you're a podcaster, get over there and get your podcast in the directory.
Very, very cool. I was gonna mention that, because that is a new podcast directory, right? A place to discover new podcasts.
And I think everyone in this forum is in it.
See, I'm a shill for your network. 2 thumbs up.
You're my new poster child.
I don't. Okay. All right. So finally, we can get into it. We will tackle this. I think I already saw a little bit of back and forth in the chat room, so it's getting lively. So we want to make sure to try to integrate the chat as much as possible, so all of you are tasked with pulling something from the chat you see going on. So chat room, have at it. And the first question, and I think, well, I guess this goes out to anyone who wants to raise their hand. Who's still confused about what we're trying to accomplish tonight? Anyone?
No.
No? All right, well, that's good. Then we've defined the problem, because I really saw a lot of that in the comments, and people saying that it's a waste of time. You shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't have this conversation. We're beating a dead horse. So, again, we're not trying to change the name podcast. We're talking more about the word and how it relates to you and your content. Okay, so good. No one's confused. All right, we can launch in. So who uses a term other than podcast, podcasting, or podcaster? I would say that we've all called it something at some point. Okay, even I, when I've encountered someone. Well, for instance, I was actually on an episode of the Emerald Show, and to pitch it to them, I didn't call it a podcast. This was at least 3 years ago, and so what they understood was internet TV show. Right at the time, I was doing a video podcast. They got it. They cast me, and I was on an episode. So I'm guilty of it myself, even though I definitely consider myself a podcaster, and what I have is a podcast. Who else has used another term besides one of these? I see Richard raising his hand to jump on. Tell us well what that means. What do you mean? What have you used?
Well, I'll tell you, I use the term internet broadcaster. I mean, having spent 20 plus years behind the microphone as a traditional broadcaster in, the regular media line, I felt that when I moved over here, podcast was kind of an antiquated term for me, because what I do is, and most of us do this, is we do a live show, which is a broadcast. The internet is our medium in which we are getting our message out. Do I make that show available for download afterwards? Absolutely. It's much like video on demand. So I kind of think of myself as an internet broadcaster and less of a podcaster. I think podcaster is a term that has been around too long, and now it's gone through phases, much like new media has. So has podcasting.
So coming from radio, do you think that people who didn't come, so how many people came to podcasting from podcast, right? So you heard a podcast, you heard of podcasting. I did. I heard a podcast and wanted to create a podcast. So while you're thinking about that, Richard, do you think that coming from a traditional media background to podcasting, that was your context, right? You were already doing similar stuff, right? Which is radio, which is content, and now it's online. Do you think that's part of what makes you relate more to internet broadcaster than podcaster?
I think so, and I think part of the reason that I chose to use the term internet broadcaster, and a lot of people that have talked to me about what I do, they automatically get it. You're on the internet and you're broadcasting. You have a regular time that you do your shows every week, much like you did in radio, much like people do in television. I kind of equate this all the way back to the birth of television, when they used to do live shows. They weren't TV box shows. They were broadcasts. They were live broadcasts, but they were broadcasts. And I think podcasting really kind of, for me anyway, podcasting is a term that needs to change in terms of the way that we do what we do now. I mean, it certainly was what we did back when podcasting got started. We recorded our shows, we put them up on an RSS feed, and that got put off to iTunes or whatever we used at that time. But now it's so open. So
I'm going to interrupt, because
Sure.
No one else is interrupting. That's what we should be doing, right?
Okay.
Someone should be interrupting here, because Richard just said podcasting, the term, it needs to change, right? And what did we say? This is not
I agree.
to change the word podcast. So come on, people. This is a place to butt in. So anyone have something to say based on what he's already said?
Yeah, actually, I do. I wanted to let him finish his sentence, though.
No.
But
That's okay. Cut me off. I don't mind.
Well, when you are describing yourself to other people who aren't familiar with podcasts, and of course you're saying that you use the term internet broadcaster, do you ever use the word podcast with them?
I do, but I don't call it a podcast, because personally I don't like the term. And I mean, that's just my personal feeling. I think we've gone way beyond the podcasting. So, and I've said this before in other forums.
If you do use the word podcast, but you also don't, when do you use the word podcast? When you're talking to someone who isn't familiar with the podcast and you're telling them about your internet broadcast, air quotes there.
Right. Well, when people ask me about it and they say, well, what do you do? I said, well, I'm an internet broadcaster. We do a show every Saturday on the internet. We don't do it on a television station, so you can't flip on your TV and find us. You'll have to go to our website and watch the show live every Saturday. Let's take that show for an example.
So we're really talking about kind of two different things, right? I think Richard's starting from a place of live streaming, and then it's a podcast for him, right? So most of us had started as podcasters, recorded, you know, in our studios, behind our mic. There wasn't a live stream. Post a podcast, repeat, right? So you know, I can see internet broadcasting as being something he relates to because he came to it and started. Sounds like he started a live stream. But Rob, anything to say there?
Yeah, I just kind of want to back up and get a little higher perspective on this. I mean, I think that the overall kind of resistance that we all have to really talking about podcasting at a broader level really gets back to the fact that that podcasting is just one form of distribution, and I think we have all kind of pinned our efforts around podcasting, but yet I think at the end of the day, and I think that the bigger direction of what's going on here is that we're all becoming online broadcasters, and I think that's what we're really tapping into, of this kind of conflict between podcasting as a download, syndication, distribution method versus streaming versus other, you know, live streaming, those kind of things that we're all getting involved in, right? And so this kind of clear definition of calling ourselves a podcast is not really necessarily broad enough to properly describe our shows. So if I think back to all the shows that I've been involved in creating or hosting or whatever, I've never had the term podcast in the title of my show, and I've never put it there for a very specific reason, and that's because my background with this goes back to broadcast, you know, on the broadcast side of a radio show, right? And so I came into it from the perspective of I'm doing an online or broadcast radio show, so I'm not going to put a specific distribution method in the title of my show because I have a cross method of how I'm trying to distribute the show, and I don't want to pigeonhole it in any one of those particular ways of distributing it. So that's kind of my bigger view of it.
Cool. And I'll stay with Rob because you know, one of the reasons I thought this topic was worthwhile, and actually because it sort of came up in recent news. So Michael Wolff, who wrote an article for Forbes magazine, Rob was actually a part of this article and a series of podcasts where he did interviews. In fact, I think he +1'd this roundtable. So, right, if I could have found that in time, I should have got him to come on here. But he is a podcaster now. I think he's relatively new to it. He was researching the medium of podcasting. So it's an interesting article. There's some interesting stuff in those interviews that I don't quite agree with, but they're cool because there's some luminaries in the space. And again, this article was in Forbes, a major magazine read by masses of the general population who may or may not have heard of a podcast. But you know, I mean, he interviewed Leo Laporte and Adam Carolla, Rob Walsh, who's got plenty to say about this, but refuse to join us, and I may talk a little bit more about that. Dan Benjamin, who absolutely hates the word podcast, and again, our very own Rob Greenlee. And so Michael asked, you know, he asked several of these guys about the word podcast. Okay, so people are still asking this question, whether people want to talk about it or not. Big media is still asking the question, right? And I think it can be important to the future to still have a discussion about where it is and where it's going. And the response, like I said, was not always positive. Now, Rob, I think you were the most recent. I haven't got to that interview yet. Did he ask you that question?
We didn't talk specifically about the name, but I've talked about it a lot, and you know what my feelings about it. I know going back to the very early days of podcasting, a lot of the podcasters that I knew that were very early in the space didn't really like the name even back then. But I think I'm not bringing this up to say that I think we should change the name or even go down that path, because I agree 150% that the ship has sailed on that. But I do think that that the media companies and the kind of the bigger picture of things is that I feel I get this feeling like that the industry is somewhat moving beyond podcasting. And it's like, but podcast is always going to be what this stuff is. I don't think the name's going to change, but I think how it's used. So if you look at like a Stitcher, or you look at like a TuneIn, or you look at some of the kind of newer networks that are popping up that are trying to integrate between broadcast radio, streaming, and on-demand shows, it feels like that's the pull of where things are going. If you look at Stitcher, doesn't use the term podcasts, but they're clearly a podcast aggregator network, right? But so there's a tension going on right now, and I think this is a very important topic, I think, for all of us to get really clear on. Though there's going to be a lot of controversy, I think, around this evolution that's, I think, starting to happen.
Let me liken this to another thing that we've found in the media field overall. Remember when DVDs first came out and people started referring to VHS movies as video and DVD? Blatant misuse of the term. That was a gigantic pet peeve of mine back in late 90s, whenever that was. Now there are Blu-rays. And so we have different things. We say, oh, do you have the DVD? And that doesn't necessarily mean now, because of the way people sometimes use it, that doesn't mean they're actually wanting the DVD. They might be wanting the Blu-ray edition. But DVD, Blu-ray, download, those are the names of how it's released, how it's produced onto a format that you can take with you.
So are you saying, Daniel, you're saying podcast and podcasters are the Kleenex of tissue?
No, not quite. It's Yeah, I know. I have a list of brand name things like that.
That's a good one.
Podcast is, I think, the name of the distribution method, because by definition, podcast means media downloadable through RSS enclosures. But what are we podcasting? We're podcasting shows or broadcasts or episodes or whatever you want to call those. And podcasting is our distribution method. So I don't think we necessarily have to only call ourselves podcasters. I think it works really well to call ourselves broadcasters, because, well, one, do you really, really want to call yourself a YouTuber? That just sounds like an insult, really. I'm a YouTuber. Instead, I'm a broadcaster who puts my voice in chipmunk noises on YouTube. That's what Fred would say. But
yeah.
So podcast is a title for the distribution, or the thing overall tied to a certain distribution. I don't think that's the only thing we need to consider that we can call this thing. I like the idea of calling it broadcast.
Well, in essence, is that not really what we're doing, though? Is we create these shows, most of us create a weekly show, and not worried about the distribution part of it, but we are creating a broadcast.
Yeah, and podcast, here's one way that you could even look at it, because I was involved with a client once who wanted this kind of verbiage, and I realized this works well. They were producing a radio program, a 90-second radio program they would play every day on local radio stations, and they wanted to also release it as a podcast. And all that really meant was just sticking that radio broadcast, MP3, 90 seconds, into an RSS feed with enclosures. So the particular verbiage that we used was get this, it was something like get this as a podcast in iTunes.
Though I have to raise another point here. I think that the term broadcast kind of implies to me a linear live piece of content.
Yeah.
That would be the only hesitation that I would bring to the table here, that using the term broadcast is maybe a little not entirely accurate to what's happening here. I think
So sorry, Rob. So as Rob Walsh would tell us, everyone right, has accepted this. In fact, he thinks it's a dead. We shouldn't be talking about it because it's a dead issue. As dead issue 6 years ago, but that goes back to changing the name, which we're not. If we're having a conversation about that,
Right.
I think that would be a dead issue. Right. We're trying to make this something different. In fact, I want to, think about how can talking about podcasts, how can we make that conversation advance what we're doing here? And so, Mark Maron, right? Tomorrow night has a show featuring a podcaster. He is a podcaster and a lead character. So podcasting is going mainstream, and these bigger names are talking about it. Like I said, there's an article in Forbes, and they're asking the question about podcast, and is podcast does it have a stigma, right? It only used to be some guys saying that podcast used to be this term where it implies there's two geeks sitting in a basement talking about Star Wars, right? So some people hesitate sometimes for that one. So maybe think about it. Does that word have a stigma? Someone can answer that one. But
did you watch the whole Mark Maron video that's out there?
I did watch the episode, and it's kind of funny because they refer to it as a show as well as the word podcast comes in, but it's almost as a dirty word.
Okay.
And they never explain what it is. They just assume everybody knows. He goes, yeah, I do a podcast. And he didn't stop and look at the camera and go, it's an internet radio show.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is good, right?
I mean, through RSS.
Yeah.
That's good, right? That's good that they're not making it a dumbed-down situation.
Yeah.
Right? I actually prefer that they don't dumb it down and explain it to the layman. Because it's really good. His podcast audience is the one who's going to watch that show.
Right. Well, and a lot of it depends on, with any kind of presentation, it depends on who your audience is. If I'm talking to somebody who's really, not into technology at all, they're wanting to start a podcast, and they ask me what's a podcast, probably the first thing out of my mouth is going to be it's an internet radio show, because they understand radio show and they understand internet. And so I think one of the things we ought to talk about is the fact that anybody can be a podcast. I think that's one of the problems, is because did Steve Jobs at one point call us amateur hour?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fact, thank you, Steve Jobs. Your legacy lives on. But also, there are plenty of people that it is the 14-year-old kid talking about Star Wars in the basement, and we don't really have a whole lot of control over what people find. There are top rankings in iTunes and things like that, but there are times. I remember the very first New Media Expo or whatever it was called back then, and there were people's actions didn't exactly reflect the most professional act, shall we say, when people were just getting hammered and doing crazy stuff. And when I left that hotel, I'm like, wow, that's kind of bad that people are like, oh, here come the podcasters. And I thought, I don't want to be a sticker in the mud, but I just thought that might. And in some ways, that might affect how people view podcasts, is by the host and by the content.
So sorry, Daniel.
Well, if you look at local TV even, you can sometimes flip through the channels and you'll find like the local yokel channel where it is super cheap stuff that looks like it was shot on a handy cam, but then just hit the next or channel button a couple more times and you get some highly produced television series.
Right.
Yeah,
Public access channels.
Yeah.
And Mark Maron in that first episode says he yells at the kid, and this kid, it's a young guy, and says, if I had Hollywood contacts, do you think I'd be doing a podcast? So it's like, oh, but Mark he's the first one to tell you that podcasting is the reason for his career, or the resurgence of his career. So, speaking to evangelizing, he is out there talking about podcasting and how it's different from other types of media. Do you think the success of podcasting depends on, in part, to our sort of evangelizing the word podcast, right? If we disagree, if we're out there using different words, if Richard's calling himself an internet broadcaster, Steve, which he's, if he said wants to be a netcaster and I want to be a podcaster, make myself the good guy. Is that a problem for the community who I think collectively wants to see this thing succeed, right?
Ray,
Go ahead, Steve.
I think you also have to look at some evolution here in what's going on with technology and the internet too. For a lot of us that started, in the early stages of this, Dave in 2005, myself in 2006, there was podcasting, and we didn't have a lot of the mediums and tools to do other things in the way that the internet and broadcasting, or whatever you want to call it, is moving down the road. And I believe also, and nobody take offense to this, a lot of newer people getting into the space are having trouble with the words, and we're trying to reinvent some things. Now, with that said, granted, because of some of the new technologies and the ease of doing this, you know, it tends to lead to a different kind of culture now, you know, with YouTube and broadcasting of podcasts. You know, I'm a podcaster. I release podcasts regardless of what my company name is and my domain name. That's what we do. But when we broadcast our live shows, we are broadcasting.
It's kind of like many people who talk about blogging and writing. Like I think Jeff Goins is one of these guys who he said, if you want to be a writer, call yourself a writer. Don't just call yourself a blogger. Because if I tell you I'm a blogger, well, then you have all kinds of ideas in your mind. What do I blog about? Probably just worthless stuff. But if I tell you I'm a writer on the internet, then you have an instant better respect for me. Now, maybe it's different with our circle here because you know the kind of variety there are with blogs. But I think there's this separate line of what do we call this to people who aren't familiar with this field and the technology? That's where I like using the phrase internet broadcaster, but I don't stick with that phrase. Like when frequently someone will come here to my house, maybe repairing the internet or doing something, and they'll see all my microphones and they'll ask, what do you do? And I ask them, my conversation with them goes like this. I ask them, do you know what a podcast is? And most of the time, because I want to find out from them, most of the time they say no. And so then I tell them, I host an internet show. It's kind of like a radio show. We talk about this and that, and I explain that a little bit. And I say we broadcast live on the internet. People can download it after we've recorded it, subscribe to it for free. We call this a podcast. So I've then educated them by explaining what I do.
And see, I think, Daniel, you kind of hit that on the head. You have to kind of educate these people that don't know what a podcast is. And if they hear that word pod, the first thing that comes out of most people's mouths is, I don't own an iPod. Mm-hmm. Well, it's not just true? On your iPod. Yeah,
really,
absolutely.
though, I mean,
I think that's happening less and less now, though.
I think it's happening a lot less.
I would say that was true in 2007. I don't know if
it feels a little.
I'm still getting a lot.
I think it's happening less now.
Canada.
Well, it's also happening less now, probably because more people have iPods now and iPhones.
Right. But you know, those people that don't, they go, well, how can I see your show if I don't have an iPod? Well, you can find our show on the internet because we're an internet broadcast, and then they automatically get it.
Yeah, and I think early 1950s, when television was coming around, people would say, what's a television, right? And you'd have to explain it to them. So a part of what we're doing is also education.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we want to bring up the Kleenex thing, but to me, the thing that people get nuts on, because of the Apple thing or because of the pod, it's like, you know, I ask, can you hand me a Kleenex? Well, technically, it's a facial tissue. And I'm sure Puffs or whoever else makes Kleenex hates that name, but you know, Kleenex was probably the first one to jump on board. It's called a podcast because Apple was the first company that, you know, it could have been called a Yahoo whatever, but they bailed after they launched their directory and
WhoCast.
Yeah, WhoCast or something like that. But Apple was the first. Apple came in, made it easy, and you know, as much as I hate the fact that Steve Jobs said we're amateur hour.
I do think you know, very polarizing figure there, Mr. Jobs.
Yeah,
I would say he had a point, and when he came out with that,
right,
there was, you know, I think everyone took the immediate offense to what he says, but if you think about it, right? I mean, it is not, you even mentioned it yourself, and we're getting a little off track here, that anyone can do it, right? It's open to everyone, and that can be good and bad. So in the most case, most people starting a podcast are amateurs, right? And so, and the recording and the value, video recording, typically back then, wasn't the standard. You know, if you flip on a radio, in most cases, it has to meet a certain standard. Podcasting didn't have that. So when he said that, I think there was a point there to differentiate between big media and what was going on. But, of course,
Mark Stapleton in the chat room asked a great question. What is an amateur podcaster? Someone who doesn't make money from it?
I disagree with that.
Maybe no training. I mean, that's just if you're going to call someone, right? I mean, we're making up a term, really, at that point, right? An amateur podcaster can be whatever you want to define it. I don't know that I don't think it's in an Urban Dictionary yet.
But if we go back to the question, is the name hindering? And again, we don't want to change the name, but Steve made a great point. The word television didn't stop TV from, now we had to shorten it. Maybe we should call it PC. I don't know. But, me, I want to shorten everything. But, at the beginning, they had to educate people what that was. And maybe that's just the problem.
Yeah, I think that one thing, years ago I used to call my show a radio show. And I think just to kind of throw this into the mix here too, I'm not necessarily leaning towards ever doing that again. Back then, I was on the radio, right? And I took my show to the internet, and I thought, even back in 2003, in that time frame, I felt like I was already moving towards taking this content and putting it out on the web and the internet. And that somehow keeping my name associated with this old time medium was a bad thing. So, but I also see this movement that's happening right now, where the broadcast medium, the radio folks are starting to realize that we're a threat, right? And so now they're coming out with activities that are turning them into on-demand radio shows or podcasts. And I see this thing where I think ultimately this radio show concept, I think that a lot of people understand what that is not a relevant description of this either. So I see this convergence. It's almost like we are coming into a point where the mass market perception of what this is, it really has to do two things. It has to evolve, and for us to reach that mass market that we all want to reach everyone, the understanding of the audience needs to kind of update and be more relevant. And I think that's the challenge that we have, is we have these conflicting legacy and future-looking models here that are converging on each other. And I don't know that there's a simple answer. I think it's just going to have to evolve over time.
Right. So I had as a question, I said, is it important that we actually separate ourselves from other types of media, TV, radio? Are we different, right? Is a podcast, whether you think that's the Kleenex, and I'm using a generic term for online content, are we different, right? Dustin, is it important to you to be separated from TV and radio? I personally don't like using the term, if I don't have to, internet radio or TV. Why? Because I'm nothing like radio or TV in terms of I don't have to. The show is mine, okay? And no one says anything about what I can do, what I can say, how I say it, how long it is, can I do it? So I feel like I'm very different, and in fact serving a completely different audience. So again, Dustin, is that important to you as a podcaster, or are you a podcaster?
I am indeed a podcaster. I've been kind of sitting back here listening just to kind of hear what was going on in the conversation, but I realized that I call myself a lot when I get the puzzled look of I'm a podcaster. I'm like, oh, well, I have an online radio show. And I don't know why I use that term, because that, like you just said, Ray, it has nothing to do with what I do. Like, I don't stream live. I don't do any other regulations that other people, that TV or radio has to take in part. But I share that I had a radio background, and so then that kind of just leads me into the conversation that, hey, you can download these and yada yada yada. But it is important that we are different, that we have our own. We can create our own content. We can make it what we want it to be. We're not under other people's stipulations, and we can really create that value that we see that we need for our podcasts or our internet shows or whatever we want to call them. Because I know that in the 2.5 years I've been doing podcasting, my show has morphed 3 or 4 different times based on what I felt the audience needed. And I didn't have to ask anybody, hey, is this okay to do?
I think if we're going to use the term radio show, though, I mean, that's bringing in another distribution method into our distribution method. So if I'm going to use the word radio show, I say it's like a radio show, but on the internet. So I never call it internet radio anything.
So this leads to the question. Sorry, guys. This leads to the question: does it matter? Are we the only people, right, that are sitting, that cares about this? Is nitpicking the right terms absolutely ridiculous, right? Since the larger, it's accepted as podcast. But is there any value to us even having this conversation?
Yeah, I think it is. I really think that there is a value that everybody needs to get more in sync on this, so we all communicate a consistent message. And I think what we're coming back to here as we're talking about this, and at least it's ringing in my head, is the fact that podcasting is its own unique content, right? And that's the friction that I've been feeling for a good 5 or 6 years now, is that the content is unique enough where it needs its own name, and that distinguishes it from radio or from broadcasting, because it is unique and it is different and it needs to be perceived that way. And I think that's why we always keep coming back to podcasting name is never going to change, because we're proud of the fact that we are different from broadcast, and at a real kind of base level, we're proud of that.
Yeah, there was an interesting exchange between Rob Walsh and Max Flight in the comments leading up to this, and there was, based around a question of, with more traditional media types entering the space, as we've, more people are coming into this, will podcasting change? And that question is inspired by, Rob saying that podcast will always remain podcast. He'll put $20 down that in 6 years we're calling it a podcast. But Max thought and thinks that once big media finds a way to monetize this thing, that they've barely touched it. And once they find a way to monetize this thing, they'll do what they always do, and they'll eat it up, and they'll find a way to make it their own. Now, of course, I'm paraphrasing, and if I slaughtered you guys' words, you were both invited on the roundtable, so you'll have to stick up for yourself in chat. But what do you think?
Well, Ray, I think you've touched a real nerve on that, because I'm starting to see some groundswells of some new networks or new platforms that are starting to be built that are not going to be using the term podcast, and that are going to create this new strata of content provider that will be only available on that platform. So you're going to have this where right now pretty much all the platforms are pretty flat, right? Where everybody is included, and it's open and all this kind of stuff. But I'm seeing, because of business and advertising, there is a perception amongst the investment community and kind of people coming from the big media side and new media side, kind of coalescing together to come up with some new ways of doing this that will stratify content providers.
So they're going to find a way to lock us out of the money. Is that what you're saying?
Not so much that, as much as though that's part of it. I see what's happening is that there's going to be a different strata of content providers that will be exclusively on certain platforms, and not.
You thought Apple was bad. Here it comes.
Yeah, and not everyone will be included, is what this means.
It's scary. So
yeah,
we'll be curious to follow that and see what's going on. It sounds like you have some interesting information there.
But it's driven based on this whole premise of what we've been talking about, is this amateur hour versus the real high-end guys, the Chris Hardwicks and the Kevin Smiths and those kind of podcasters that are aggregating large audiences. They're maybe not necessarily doing niche podcasting. They're really more like a broadcast show is what they are. But it's interesting how this tension is coming around business.
Rob, you make a really good point there, because when we were going after advertising for our show, when we started out calling it a podcast, nobody wanted to talk to us. As soon as I changed to calling it an internet broadcast, the ears peak up and, they're willing to listen to your pitch.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
I will say an interesting note when if I type podcasting into Twitter or Facebook, red dots. Spell check says, what's that word? So I'm just saying, the internet's locking us out too. So.
Yeah, so Twitter is not compatible with the Webster's dictionary, huh?
Neither is Word.
Neither is Word. Oh, well.
Yeah.
There's a whole other debate to be had there, I guess.
Yes.
All right, so what else, guys?
Well, I think we need to hear from Steve about why he chose the name Netcast.
Oh, there you go.
He thought he's just being quiet over there, and I'm busy checking out the next question, and Steve thought he was going to give it away.
Daniel.
That's what we're here for. Remember, you know what? The thing about this roundtable, this was started for fun, right? If you talk about guys in their basement geeking out, that's why I do this. Okay, so we gather to have fun. So if we jump on Steve, it's all in fun. And
you know what? Y'all bring it on.
That's right.
Can I tell you a secret?
I'm
only 5'5", but I'll stand up.
Yeah, well, there you go. So
Steve and Leo Laporte, they're on the same side on this one.
Well, Steve might be a bit of a Leo disciple, right? I mean, I think that you started out. You like the guy. See, look at that picture with Leo there. Right? And you know what? If you're going to be in good with someone, Leo's probably a good person to be in good with in the podcasting world. So maybe Steve knows something we don't.
Too, so that was cool.
Oh, well, he can afford
it.
All
right, so
that's what we all think. Steve, underneath your name there, in your pretty little lower third, it says at Netcast Studio. So why don't you tell us about the genesis of the name of your studio and anything related to why it's called Netcast?
When I started all this, it was prior to Leo coming up with those battering words about Netcast.
Oh, did you just go head-to-head with Leo and say, I was there first?
No, not at all. Actually, that domain name has been around for a long time with me. But let me preface, and like I said before, is that I'm a podcaster. We produce podcasts. We post podcasts. We distribute podcasts. We stream podcasts. That is totally different than what my domain name and my company name is. That is a word for people to bring inside the studio to provide or to see the content, but has nothing to do with the type of content it is, if that makes sense. So, everybody asks me about that. Why are you on the side of that? Well, it's a nomenclature of business and not necessarily what we produce. So this name has been around for a long time, regardless of what people have picked up in terms of netcast or podcast or, call it whatever you want, a goobcast. I don't care. But, when it comes down to identification, it's worked very well for us, thus the name, but is not really an association to the type of content we produce.
I remember several years ago, our mutual friend, Cliff Ravenscraft from Podcast Answer Man, was starting his business, and it was originally going to be called Bitcast Media. So I think for that very similar reason that you're talking about, Steve, that just not saying necessarily what you do, what you host, but kind of describing what you do, sort of. Like you're saying it's kind of an abbreviation for you, right?
Yeah, because, actually this name has crept up and had this discussion conversation because eventually this term netcast came out, which was really not the initial identifier of what we were doing. It was a brand name, it was a website name, it was a company name. Thus, it was built off of that. But I'm a podcaster.
Leo Laporte even said that at his keynote at New Media Expo in 2013. He said, "I'm a podcaster," and he got a little bit of applause from that when he pointed that out.
Welcome back. Welcome back, Leo. Welcome back to Facebook. Welcome back to podcasting.
I'm never going to put a lower third on again.
Well, and the reason he said that was because that's what butters his bread. is podcasting. If you look at the numbers that he gets that pays the bills and brings in the millions of dollars that comes in, and it's based on his RSS-based syndication, which is podcasting.
And that actually reminds me of something I hadn't thought about before, and something that I sort of is a personal crusade for me, and that's video podcast, right? So what butters Leo's bread, careful how you say that, is the audio side, right? He dedicated his studio to video. He wants to be in video. But I often find that a lot of people, even podcasters, tend to separate out video. When you say podcast, I guarantee 90% of people they're using it as a synonym for an audio show, right? So how is even that? So we're even split inside of our own medium when we refer to the word as podcast as generic for audio. So anyone got a thought about that?
You're right. I'm guilty of that.
Yeah, I think that the whole video side of podcasting is kind of getting left behind a little bit in the discussion and in the business models that are being discussed, as I think that there's a certain acceptance that YouTube has won the battle. And that video podcasting doesn't really have a place in the future.
Well, I know for a while Rob Walsh from Libsyn was he had a graphic that showed like the top podcasts. He had taken a screenshot of iTunes, and let's say there were 60 on the front page showing the top. 2 of them were video.
Yeah.
So.
Right.
But I think that's what fuels that.
Right. So YouTube is the 300, 800-pound gorilla. But, if you have a YouTube show, why would you not put that in a podcast feed, right?
Exactly.
Why not be everywhere? As
Cost.
Our friend Pat Flynn. You know what? That's a good point, because when I started as a video podcaster. That's why it's a little personal to me. And, these days the options for hosting and, just to deliver video is tougher. And we can't put our video on YouTube, which is interesting. Because a lot of people think they also mix those things too, right? If you have a YouTube channel, they think you have a podcast, right? But we all know that YouTube is not a podcast. I can subscribe to a channel, but I can't then download it, have it put on my device, and take it anywhere for consumption at any time. The internet becoming ubiquitous, but it's not a podcast. We have technical specs, and it is not. So, again, if you have a YouTube show. Or is YouTube so different? I think Rob, you're real into this this conversation about podcasts. Some do well as podcasters, and some do well as YouTubers, as Daniel's favorite term, YouTubers. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I think to kind of hark back a little bit to wrap up on the whole video side of it is that if you look at now, granted, the reference that Rob points to is that like 2% of the iTunes top 100 is video podcasts. I would say if you were to go in and look at the Zune platform today, it's about 23% of the top 100 is video podcasts today. So it's still a significant chunk of the usage of the platform. Though I think if you look at the Apple platform just in general and its roots, there's far more players out there that were initially part of the Apple ecosystem that did not play video, right? So they have a very strong roots in audio distribution. So looking at that ranking chart, it is going to skew more towards audio. Though so anyway, I wanted to wrap up on that too. That I think that video still has a significant place in this space, but it's kind of being forgotten about. It's not a focus that a lot of media companies are focused on, and even a lot of smaller networks and podcasts, because they see this huge dollar sign when it comes to distributing video. It's a challenge.
And if we go one step backwards, if you say, well, I'm not a broadcaster because I'm not broadcasting live, and if I say podcast, nobody understands it. If I go one step back towards a more generic answer and I say I'm a content producer, then that's people are like, what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's not going to work either.
You can actually find in one of my bios, there are many, somewhere it says Ray Ortega, web producer. All right, and so because I do produce content that does not go inside of a feed, it's not a show, right? It's not episodic, which are important elements in the podcast definition to me. So at the same time, depending on, again, we talked about the audience you're talking to. In my circle of hardcore video guys who make stuff for Vimeo, it's not a podcast. They make beautiful images for video, right? So I produce content for the web that's also not a podcast. So it does, again, I identify myself as a podcaster. I started as a podcaster. I now have a career professionally producing podcasts for a network. So I love the roots, and I'm definitely a champion for the name, but I do find places where I consider myself other things besides a podcaster.
But do you guys not think that this whole nonsense that's going on with Personal Audio LLC is going to change how we perceive what a podcast is in the near future?
I don't think it's going to have any impact at all. Do you want my frank answer to that question?
Yeah, dealing with them, we do want frank answers. I haven't even really addressed it because I think it's
not a. I don't see it as a big thing right now. I know that they're going after CBS and the NBC folks and suing these bigger content providers. From what I know, that they haven't been successful in any of these efforts yet. So it's a pending threat, but I don't know that it's really going to touch all aspects of it, and I certainly haven't seen any impacts from any of those big media companies to back away from podcasting because of it. So, up to this point, it's pretty much a non-event. So that's the honest truth from what I'm seeing. But that could change.
Yeah, and the personal audio thing is about the whole model, not just the name. They're not saying that.
No, I agree. It's about the model in how we do what we do.
Yeah.
So we'll see here over the next couple months if one of these suits actually goes to court and there's a ruling that comes down. That's when things get a little more serious. But because right now, those guys are just sending out threatening letters is what they're doing and hoping that people come to the table and just settle out of court.
Hey, cash grab.
Yep.
Cool. Well, we're approaching the hour, so we should funnel ourselves towards the door, right? It's closing time. One last call for, okay, I won't start singing, but again, I show my roots as growing up in the 90s with my bad one-hit wonder 90s music. Let's see. I did ask in the beginning for you guys to think about how a conversation about the word podcast can push us and the medium forward. I don't know if anyone has anything to say about that. Do you think that in the discussion we've had tonight, or you know what, I guess more important is what's the takeaway, right? We started off with a simple concept. Let's talk about that word podcast, right? And what it kind of means to you. What's your takeaway in maybe the discussion we've had tonight, or how you define the word, or the future of podcasts? Pick anything. I'm trying to make this as simple as possible, but we'll start to head out on that thought. If anyone wants to answer that off the top of their head, someone thinks they've got an answer as a personal takeaway, right, about the conversation about the word podcast and the medium.
I think the takeaway should be, or what I'm taking away from this is we need to keep educating people on what we're doing, not just take it for granted. And when we say, oh, I host a podcast, and they say, oh, okay. And they have no idea what we just said. It's like Greek to them. So I think we should be connecting with them, educating them, and taking ourselves seriously, especially when we're trying to approach bigger companies or something, and they might look at us and say, oh, podcast, little guy, amateur, but take ourselves seriously and really educate the people out there. That doesn't mean you stop calling yourself a podcaster or we stop using the word podcast, but it means consider who you're talking to and educate them on what you actually do.
I think you got a great point there, Daniel. I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said we do have to educate people more about what we do on a regular basis.
And the influence we have. That's the other thing I think that gets underreported is, yeah, Mark Maron has 2.5 million downloads a month. You know, God bless him. But, you know, there are people with much smaller audiences that, Jason Van Orden from Internet Business Mastery blew away the competition that had, multiple times his list size on an internet business promotion. Why? Because Jason had influence with his audience. And I think that's the true power of podcasting.
Mm-hmm. All right. Dave with a little branding there, which I appreciate. I was going to do it for you. Power of podcasting.
So
we seem to be going in a line here. So, Dustin, if you have any thoughts, you can grab another beer.
I think I would agree with both the statements so far, especially with Daniel's. We just need to make a better job, or do a better job, of describing to people what a podcast is and how we do it, or what it means to us, I guess. We've come across, there's 7 of us here tonight, and we've all come up with different ideas. We all have our own little thing. Like, some people might stream them live, some might do them, not have anything online, just have them download. Some are video, some are whatever. But just kind of share that, hey, this is what we do. We're creating content that people can download that fits their target, whatever they want to listen to. I guess I don't know how to say that, but we're creating specific content for people to consume that are interested in the topic, and so I think that kind of what sets us apart from mainstream media or radio or things like that.
Right. Podcasting is different, right? And like you said, Dave, the influence factor is very important, and it sounds like we may have a sort of another side of the advertising whole thing coming at us with trying to lock down some things and letting in only certain people. But hopefully advertisers will realize too that the power that we really have in terms of it doesn't take a massive number. It's about engagement, right? I think is what Dan Benjamin would say. You don't need a massive audience, right, for podcasts, and that really is kind of the difference. We're either serving the underserved or the hyper interested in a niche topic, and so I think that makes us very different. And I think that even talking to advertisers who maybe shun the word podcast, we can probably do a better job of educating them, right? Whether they want to listen or not. We can stick up for our medium and say you're really screwing up. Actually, like if you're not in podcasting, if you're not giving money to podcasters and advertising on podcasts, you're going to lose pretty soon. And it sounds like some of what Rob's saying is they're starting to understand that, but we have still work ahead of us to help out the small guy too, because while a lot of what we're doing, even this here could be perceived as amateur, but all of us, we try to have good audio. All right, we each have shows that are produced. They're not amateur shows, right? The content is certainly not amateur. I don't think anyone's audio here is amateur because people care about the presentation of their brand and their podcast. So before I go off too far in that, I think it's important, again, that we talk, like you guys are saying, educate, and be a champion for podcasting. And even if you are not considering yourself a podcaster, or if you are calling yourself, maybe you consider yourself a podcaster, but you're calling yourself internet broadcaster, doesn't exclude you from the conversation of even if you're using podcast as the Kleenex, right, as the generic term, we can push the medium forward. Because really, I think all of us here would love to make a living at this with our actual podcast. And that's not, that's a whole other conversation about monetizing podcast and all the different ways to do that. Doesn't mean you have to sell your podcast. So anyways, I'm out. Richard, any closing thoughts?
No, I just think this was a great conversation, guys. Thanks for having me on. It was great to butt heads with some of you guys about what the term really means, and I actually gained a whole new appreciation for the word. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't think we butt heads too much. Kind of spur that on here at the Roundtable, but again, it's about fun, and I only try to push the debate. And I think Rob did a good job of pushing the debate in the chat. And if you are listening to this, you should probably go check out the event page on Google Plus for Podcasters Roundtable Round 12, because the comments, they're really interesting, and an interesting, awesome part of the way we're doing this podcast, right? Okay, there's a thing. Technically, what we're doing right now, it's not a podcast. Okay, we're recording via Google Plus Hangouts on Air. This is going to be recorded and sent to YouTube, but until I actually take an extra step to turn it into an audio file and publish it to a feed, it's not a podcast. So right now we're recording. There's a debate there. I think Dan and I talked about that, about like recording a podcast while you're live streaming. Anyways, so some interesting stuff there. But yeah, if you're listening to the podcast edition of this, then go on over. Just go to podcastersroundtable.com. You can get all the links there. Rob Greenlee, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I don't think that generally that the industry and everyone that's involved is really making any significant mistakes around how they're talking about this. And I think using the term podcast is appropriate. And I think for different content providers, different people, using the term more is more relevant than others maybe don't need to use it as much, right? I think, like Daniel's show, he is he's like a podcast consultant. Ray, you're doing that. I think it's appropriate to have podcasts in your name of your show. So I think each one of us needs to make our decisions based on what's right for our show and our audience and how we market our show. And some other shows just don't use the term podcast, and I think that's okay. And the syndication is just part of how that show is distributed. So I think that there's no significant change that needs to happen, I don't think. I think we're all making our appropriate decisions for what we're doing. But I do think that the big part of this is we all need to educate, just like what everybody said, also around trying to up our game, right? To improve the quality of our programming, to do what it takes to produce quality shows, and that will change that outward kind of view of this medium as being amateur hour. If everybody involved in it helps each other and boosts each other up and makes better content, I think that's the key to all of our success in the long run.
Awesome. Yeah, well, thanks again, Rob, for joining us. And quickly, Rob is an excellent resource if you're listening to this right now. If your show isn't on the Windows platform, formerly known as Zune, it's like Prince, man.
It's still Zune, it's still out there, but yeah.
Check out the Podcaster Studio. We had a conversation about that. Clearly, I didn't get the message,
it's
but
okay.
I'm a little confused, Rob. We all are. But my point is,
I understand.
Get in touch with Rob. Rob, what's your email? Because you are an incredible resource for podcasters, and you should be on your platform.
Well, I think the easiest way to just reach out to me, and it's the easiest one to kind of remember because my work email is kind of hard to communicate, but just send an email to podcasts, and that's with an S, at Microsoft.com. And if you're a podcaster watching this and you want to get your show into my catalog on Windows Phone and in the Zune software, just send that email to me, podcasts at Microsoft.com. And if you wanted to follow me on Twitter, I comment a lot about what's going on in podcasting space, and then also publish screenshots of the Zune software. So if you are using a Mac and you can't see the features in the Zune software, if you follow me, I put those out twice a week, so you can see if your show has been featured or anything like that, or if you just want to see what's going on in that software as well. So that's part of the kind of the Windows Phone kind of Zune platform. So
cool. Well, thanks. And who left me out in the cold? I'm the only one without a lower third. Who was that? Rob? Was that you? You figured out how to do that during the hangout?
I did.
All right. I shouldn't even given you that tip. No more tips for Rob. All right, Steve.
I'm last again.
Dude, best for last. Best for last. Come on, man.
Now that you guys have said everything, what else is there to say? Well, number one.
You love me.
We'll talk offline, buddy.
Steve, we all love you.
All
I can say.
It's turned into a love fest.
I'm starting to like Google Hangouts.
Podcast stock. 2013.
First of all, this chat room tonight has been insanely awesome.
Awesome.
It's one of the best I've seen, and that's because of the topic. And I don't think any of us went through tonight without saying one sentence about anything without saying the word podcast.
That's a
So
good point.
it's an ingrained word in us.
Yeah.
It's a part of who we are and what we do.
Steve,
And,
can you hand me a podcast? My nose is a little.
But Rob is right about one thing, and that's create the best content we can. It's going to spark enthusiasm, and it's also going to spark question. What is that? How can I get it? Well, here's how you go about it. And I think that's one of the things that are really important. I think all of us here are podcasters, regardless of other types of terminology. That is the root of it. And lastly, I want to give one plug, and that's to Dustin for creating a brilliantly produced podcast. I think it's just a magnificent podcast. And if you haven't seen it, you go to yourwebsiteengineer.com and please check it out. Thank you for all you do, Justin. It's awesome.
Thank you, sir. Glad to create a podcast about websites.
Very cool. Well,
Yeah.
Dustin got his one URL. I was going to say we're running a little over, so one URL. We will start with you first, Steve, because I know it's very important to you. Steve, URL, whatever you want. Where can we find you? Where could
Can
you
I say it last?
No, you say it now.
netcaststudio.com.
Awesome.
We do podcasts.
Rob Greenlee.
If you want to follow the New Media Show, just go to newmediashow.com. And Twitter is probably a pretty good place, and that's at Rob Greenlee. Oh, I'm sorry.
Rob breaks the rule. Take his lower third away.
That's right. Okay. I'll
Richard
drop it
Cleveland. Richard Cleveland.
You can find me at nakedapeprod.com.
Awesome. Go to podcastersroundtable.com, please. And actually, what we could really use for this roundtable, I tend to start too many shows, so I'd like to keep this one going. Some reviews and iTunes would really help us get other podcasters in here to share their opinions, so we appreciate that. And share, right? Tell other people who love podcasting about this show, and then we can bring more of you on, and it's this great big circle, and we can have podcast stock again in 2014. All right. Dustin got his, yourwebsiteengineer.com. Dave Jackson.
Schoolofpodcasting.com.
Always to the point. I love it. Daniel J. Lewis.
Check me out, all of my podcasts, like Once Upon a Time and How to Podcast, at noodle.mx.
I think he pulled a fast one on us.
That's right.
I think
One
him and
URL.
Rob- Yeah. That's
And
Go,
he is not-
Daniel, go.
all right.
he is not monkeying around.
That means our time is up. We have to go. So again, the chat room, awesome. When I'm done with these shows, my email says like 250. I have 250 emails because every comment comes in as an email. That's awesome. That's fun. And I do actually scroll. I go to bed and I scroll through the entire thing. A lot of people get +1s, and I try to answer questions if it's something we didn't cover. So the chat is so cool. I obviously couldn't bring enough of it in as I wanted to. We're working on that. We're only at episode 12 here, so it's a work in progress, but the key is you want to be on the roundtable, right? So if you're in chat, I know you're out there, we'll get you on a roundtable. Just get a hold of me and say you're interested in doing this, because we want to hear from all podcasters. That is the point of Podcasters Roundtable. Okay, we will see you for lucky number 13 next time. Thanks again for joining us. Everyone can wave bye. It's like isn't